Morning, everybody. There's a step here now, so everyone will be a bit taller today. It's a pleasure to welcome those of you who came yesterday back into the auditorium for our very special Turner 250 conference. For those of you who didn't come yesterday, we're really delighted to be hosting this in partnership with the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, and it's been made possible with funding from the Manton Foundation and support from the Turner Society. I won't give you much more of a preamble because we do need to get started, but I've just got a couple of housekeeping notes. So first of all, I should say that the conference is being recorded, just so that you all know that. And on timekeeping, again, may I ask that all speakers and chairs keep to time. We do have a lot to get through again, and we want to make sure that those coffee breaks, can run to the whole time. At lunchtime, as yesterday, you're very welcome to keep your bags and everything else in the auditorium. We're the only people who have access to this space, and there's somebody outside who'll be, a member of our staff is outside on hand, but bags are left at your own risk. Could I also ask you to turn your phones onto silent, please? And this, I've got quite a long list, actually. The loos, the toilets, are in the foyer behind you, just beyond where you put your cloaks, your coats even, in the cloakroom. How old-fashioned. And then a serious one, if the fire alarm sounds, it's not a drill, so we need to evacuate up the stairs, via the doors at the back of the auditorium and out. The assembly point is out through what is our staff entrance and through into the car park, just here. I should also draw attention to things you may not have seen when you registered. At the desk at the beginning, where you came in the foyer, we've got various leaflets available that might interest you, but there's one that I wanted to draw your attention to, which is for a 20% discount on Tate titles from the Tate shop. Oh, look at that. There it is. So there's the QR code, which is on the desk at the beginning, but also PMC20 is the code if you're online. Should you need any help with any directions or anything, just ask me or Nicola or anyone else with a red Tate lanyard or a PMC one. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Tom, the chair of our first session. Thank you very much.
Right, hello, welcome to panel 4, Eco-Critical Approaches to Turner. I'm really pleased to be chairing such a strong panel today with 5 speakers who are at the forefront of a really important area of Turner studies. I'm Tom Ardill. I've done a little bit of work in this area with an exhibition at Turner's House, A World of Care, Turner and the Environment, and just finished the short introduction to Turner and eco-criticism in the Turner and Constable exhibition catalogue. That's supposed to be a sort of useful primer of all the work, all the scholarship in this area. Though thanks to our panellists, it's already going out of date. Many of them have recently published or have forthcoming publications. So this is a really live area, and I'm sure it's going to continue to develop very quickly. Thanks mainly to our panellists who are all kind of busy working in this area. So I will introduce the first of them, who's Martha Cattell. They're an artist, researcher and curator whose work explores the ethics and representations of the natural world. Their AHRC-funded PhD explored the visual and material cultures of 19th century whaling industry. Martha will be exploring water in Turner, showing how his works represent environmental harm and tie in with continued intersectional representations of water present in contemporary art today. So Martha, welcome you to the stage.
So you can see this title has slightly changed, but it's still the same. And I apologise, I've been a bit unwell since I arrived in London. So if I'm a bit lethargic, then please do forgive me. So I begin at the end, heading down the Thames towards St Paul's Cathedral, where Turner's funerary monument, created by Patrick McDowell in 1851, stands. As visitors shuffle past the sculpted figure of the artist, he holds a wooden palette and brushes in his hand. At the base of the monument, you can just make out a starfish motif, which Turner frequently returned to, alongside a piece of bladderwrack seaweed, definable by its distinctive vesicles. Carved from marble, a material widely used and extracted during the mid-19th century, the monument speaks to Turner's place within the maritime world. His biographer, Walter Thornbury, described him as half a sailor, while Christine Riding argues that he created an entirely new maritime aesthetic. Notably, however, the monument lacks human-centered conventional nautical symbols, such as an anchor or a rope. Instead, it highlights these natural elements of the ocean. The bladderwrack also seemingly appears attached to the rock by a holdfast, suggesting perhaps it is still alive. Turner, one could argue then, is positioned there within the intertidal zone between land and sea, making him arguably half fish rather than half a sailor. This paper, however, does not seek to determine whether Turner possessed an ecological consciousness. Instead, it examines selected liquid waterscapes to consider how they might serve as haunted representations of ecological extraction, taking the term from the growing work on eco-hauntology, which explores past ecological impacts and their legacies in the present. Also, as Tom van der Reen notes in Extinction Studies, while we must remain true to the facts, witnessing insists on truths that are not reducible to populations and data, and fleshier, more livelier truths that must foster ideas of accountability and care. With this in mind, I use a number of different case studies, from shoreline fishing and shipbuilding in Scarborough, a scribble in a notepad, to canvases of open water whaling. Tracing these watery scenes across Turner's work, lingering, pausing, looping back, I explore how they can be read as ecologically haunted spaces rather than flattened stages for human history, and what this shift in exploring ghosts might enable us to see. Perhaps it is also worth reminding us of the depths of a canvas. It has layers of context that surround and frame it, and that is full of pauses, resistances, and, as I will show, some hauntings. It is here that we must attune ourselves differently to other scales, other rhythms, and other ways of seeing. As Tom mentioned, it is encouraging to see this panel included in the programme and to recognise the number of other people who aren't speaking but have forwarded the ecological dimensions of Turner's work. They demonstrate a growing field that continues to situate Turner within an urgently needed context and further its intersectionality with colonial and capitalist narratives. So, water is defined, or perhaps made undefinable, by its contrasts: depth and drought, flood and deluge, freshwater and saline. It is sea, it is ocean, it is puddle, it is the Thames you probably walked past to get here, and it is us. In Turner's time, water was increasingly mobilised as a source for capital, intertwined with travel, trade, and colonial expansion. From attempts to find the Northwest Passage to hydrological mapping and the transatlantic slave trade. It was also central, it should be noted, to ritual, leisure, and artistic inspiration. The British coastline in particular became a site for heightened interest, both for recreation, recording, and for natural history. The creation of the Brighton Cure by Richard Russell in 1750 highlighted the therapeutic potential of bathing in and even drinking the salty seawater, as well as other things such as having your skin rubbed with fresh seaweed. More broadly, the sea has always been thought of as this healing space, with spa waters discovered in various seaside towns, for example, in Scarborough in the 17th century, and again in the 20th century, the same town was described as the tonic holiday, but a tonic that was and is still riddled with human-made pollution and waste. So this curative coastline was frequently captured by Turner's brush and pencil, particularly its thriving fishing industry. These shorelines function as liminal zones, elemental boundaries of crossing and transition, a dialogue, as Robert Macfarlane puts it, between solid and liquid. A keen fisherman himself, Turner reportedly spent more time fishing than painting, much to the annoyance of one of his patrons, Sir John Lester. In this painting, Scarborough Castle Boys Crab Fishing, he hints at the town's maritime trade. You can see a shrimper in the middle by the shoreline catching their wares, and two Young boys absent-mindedly crab as a crustacean scuttles from their basket. In a further painting, again of Scarborough, you can see another shrimper, this time standing in the centre, staring out towards us. And you can also make out groups of individuals washing their clothes in the sea. They wring and squeeze their dirt out into the saline mix, which would have floated away alongside detritus from the fishing industry and human waste, which would have also been disposed of directly into the sea from the townsfolk. Through the haze behind the figures in both of these canvases, a multitude of sails and masts suggests the scale of the local sea-focused activity. In the late 18th and 19th century, Scarborough's fishing focused on abundant inshore species such as sole and turbot. In the 1840s, the discovery of the so-called silver pits in the deep waters off Dogger Bank enabled large-scale demesurable catches for human consumption, with demand increasing due to the rise in tourism. The haze of masts also alludes to the town's busy shipping industry, and you can see in the corner of the canvas a ship being built. The industry peaked between the 1700s and 1800s, with up to 11 shipyards located along the foreshore, where if you visit now, it is replaced by arcades. Thousands of trees sourced domestically and overseas were required to build ships, primarily for local fishing and leisure, though it is known that at least 2 vessels were constructed in the mid-18th century to transport enslaved people as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Ruskin references this work specifically, stating that it possesses a calmness with glittering of the morning clouds and trembling of the sea, and that the most multiple examples of reflection and repetition creates peaceful things. However, akin to Jane Bennett's idea of vibrant matter, the piece I suggest more so trembles with an entangled blur of ecological pressure. From the building of the ships to the removal of the fish from the sea, it is a work that maybe appears less explicit in this ecological subject matter, but by dissecting it, it shows the larger extractive endeavours at play. Moving on to a further coastal industry, that being the cultivation of seaweed. This was a growing trade during this period, including, again, in towns such as Scarborough. Today, various organisations grow seaweed for carbon capture, but it's also used in big pharmaceuticals and in wide scale in the beauty industry. In Turner's time, it was collected for various uses, including as a fertiliser, but also for its iodine. And this is a material which I am personally focused on a lot more in my work recently. It appears in several of Turner's work, including in Clovelly Bay, where donkeys on the beach are loading what is assumed to be, there's some discussion about this, either lime or seaweed in the baskets on their back. And in a closer study, it is found in this small sketch from Scarborough from the south, study of seaweed. You can see a sketch of the town's castle perched atop the cliffs in a rather hurried style in pen and ink, and to the left is the quick scribble depicting seaweed. No shading, just the outline, and some circles again appearing to be ventricles, reminiscent of the bladderwrack I mentioned earlier. The sketch flattens the seaweed, pressing its form in a manner similar to later cyanotypes by Anna Atkins, or the popular press specimens by the like of women natural historians and collectors such as Georgina Wise, who would have scoured the shoreline for pieces and putting them in their books. Historian Molly Duggan notes that these preserved natural history specimens were enlisted to extend and facilitate an intimate engagement with the natural world. In Turner's sketchbook, the seaweed offers a small reminder of a real encounter and the wider fascination with a particular material through the desire to document it. Noticeably, it is drawn in almost a similar scale as the sketched castle on the same page. And it is about noticing these small natural elements and highlighting their value and histories alongside larger scale discussions and pieces. For my last example, and a more explicit in subject, I'm turning to the whaling industry, which was booming in Turner's time, with regular voyages in the Arctic and South Seas in search of species from sperm whales to North Atlantic right whales. Whales provided resources, blubber and oil to lubricate pistons and engines, oil for street lamp, and bone or baleen used in corsets, umbrellas, whips. The list is kind of endless, but it was a precursor to plastic. Turner created 4 paintings along with numerous sketches, likely intended for his patron, Ellen Bicknell, who owned a spermaceti business. The first 2 exhibited paintings correspond to certain pages of the popular book at the time, Thomas Beale's The Natural History of the Sperm Whale. In 1846, Turner produced a second pair to accompany the first, all shown together here. Critics largely derided these works, with one asking if Turner had just thrown an egg at the canvas, while another in the Almanac of the Month quipped whether the second painting should be titled, "Hello There, the Oil and Vinegar, Another Lobster Salad." Yet, visually, the works convey the brutality of the trade. You can see, I think I've got a picture of this, yeah. The blood sprays from the head of a sperm whale in anguish. And you can see in another one, the ghostly head of a sperm whale hanging from the ship's mast in the distance, almost haunting the scene with its mouth open in a cry. The quartet form a sequential narrative, likely designed to capitalise on contemporary taste for whaling, big game hunting, and colonial exploitation. The cyclical composition not only depicts the stages of the hunt, but suggests the repetitive industrialised nature of whaling. If intended for a patron in the whaling trade, these paintings would have symbolised commercial success and continuity. Interestingly, the works never reached Bicknell, perhaps because they conveyed less human triumph than the title suggests. Other more regional whaling paintings, produced at the time and as explored in my PhD work, depict the trade in a much more restrained manner. Here, for example, John Ward's Whalers in the Arctic was likely commissioned to hang in the whaling captain's offices in the port town of Hull. In the foreground edge of the scene, you can see 2 icebergs framing the scene. That's similar to a tree in a Claudian landscape. They allow for the adoption of tropes of the picturesque, especially with the curved waterways which your eye is led throughout the piece. Between this, there is a right whale being harpooned, but there is little or no blood, despite 3 puncture wounds. Here, then, there is a clear sanitation of human violence, recalling Eleanor Hughes' analysis of battle paintings, but has a similar relevance here, which had the effect of glamorising and legitimising the practices and institutions, and emphasised British corporate action, unified, well-managed, and on an independent scale. Ward's work then depicts the strength of the whaling crew as championing over both animals and the kind of hostile, icy landscapes of the Arctic. It emphasises a well-controlled state of the industry. Furthermore, the men appear unemotional, consequently reducing them as figures for their use as labour, becoming part of a wider system of capitalist endeavours at play. It is worth showing this work in discussions around Turner's depictions of whaling. Although both are different in style, it articulates how the trade was inexplicably linked to artist depictions through the commissions of more idealistic portrayals such as Ward, and the initial interest from Bicknell in Turner's work. Jason Edwards reads Turner's whaling scenes as showing the ravages of an industrial whaling, and is a reading particularly resonant in our present era of crisis. To finish, in Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon comments, "Haunting and the appearance of spectres or ghosts is one way we are notified that what's been concealed is very much alive and present. By attaining then to the traces of seaweed, fishing fleets and whaling in Turner's work, we can then read his waterscapes as ecologically haunted spaces, recording not only ongoing examples of activity for capital and profit, but also the often overlooked lives of the non-human beings. These works, like the liminal shoreline spaces, are entangled and sticky with elements. They show both abundance and devastation, embedded with histories of maritime trade, colonial exploration, and species extraction, while reflecting on the contemporary urgency of these issues today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Martha. So Tobah Aukland-Peck is our next speaker. She holds a PhD in art history from the Graduate Centre of the City University of New York and is a postdoctoral fellow supported by Paul Mellon Centre. She has published widely, most recently the essay Turner's Pencil, Graphite Landscapes and Extractive Industry in the November issue of British Art Studies. And her current book project is about modernist British art and extraction. But today she's speaking about the 1928 Thames flood, which flooded the basement here at Tate and affected works on paper by Turner. And she's investigating the material and commercial conditions of the Turner Bequest.
Thank you for having me, and I'm very glad to be here in conversation with Tom, my fellow panelists, and all of you. And I'm grateful to the Tate, all the staff here, and the PMC, especially Kathleen, as well as for the support of the Turner Society. My talk today is Watermarks, Environmental Contingencies and the Turner Bequest. Many of us have been fortunate to see Turner's works on paper in the Tate Prints and Drawings Room, invaluably aided by the Tate staff. Access to the artist's notebooks and studies has been a defining factor of Turner scholarship. While these objects, as we heard yesterday, still have a complicated place in the public imagination, it might be said that our scholarly understanding of the artist and his process is constructed from paper. When the Turner Bequest was accessioned by the National Gallery in 1856, 5 years after Turner's death, over 20,000 works on paper entered the national collection. Paintings like Dido building Carthage, one of 300 in the bequest, were monumental. At about 1.5 by 2.5 meters, this is a clear edifice of Turner's artistic accomplishment. Yet, the scale of the sketchbooks, loose pencil drawings, and watercolors that accumulated in the lower galleries of the National Gallery and later the Tate were likewise significant, interrogating the supremacy of the oil paintings. These studies, many stylized, hasty, or illegible, show an artist iterating on the world around him, documenting both the mercurial climates he encountered on his extensive travels and the creative process of translating these environments into visual form. In 1856, John Ruskin, appointed as the keeper of the paper bequest, rushed home from a trip to Scotland to begin wrangling the haphazard pile into a body of art. He greeted what he saw with dismay, a reaction worth quoting at length. In 7 tin boxes, I found upwards of 19,000 pieces of paper drawn upon by Turner in one way or another, some in chalk, which the touch of a finger would sweep away, others in ink rotted into holes, others long eaten away by damp and mildew and falling into dust at the edges, in capes and bays of fragile decay, others worm-eaten, some mouse-eaten, many torn, dust of 30 years accumulation, black, dense, and sooty, lay in the rents of the crushed and crumpled edges, producing altogether unexpected effects in brilliant portions of skies, whence an accidental or experimental finger mark of the first bundle unfolder had swept it away. Ruskin describes a collection of mutable objects, which not only documented climactic phenomena, rough seas and dramatic sunsets, but whose physical form was shaped by environmental contingencies, rain spattering pages during an 1801 trip to Scotland, or the wonderful 1798 page from Wales that is in the show upstairs, and I highly recommend going to go look at, and studio coal fires spewing dense soot. The studio was an environment in dialogue with the natural world. Even after Turner put down his pencil, the sketches from his archive were in a state of formation. The image, I argue, not damaged, but further developed by organisms, mildew, mice, cats, or human fingers, and climate, dusty air, damp London winters, and, as I will show today, natural disaster. Acknowledging their physical condition reveals an ongoing exchange between Turner's legacy and the British environment. Ruskin's cataloging process, itself a haphazard one, intended to conserve a static record of one of Britain's foremost artists. Yet Ruskin could not help but acknowledge the collection's ontological state of disintegration, worrying in an 1859 lecture, "I fear from the very number of Turner's works left to the nation that there is a disposition now rising to look upon his vast bequest with some contempt. I beg of you, if in nothing else, to believe me in this, that you cannot further the art of England in any way more distinctly than by giving attention to every fragment that has been left by that man." In attending to the fragmentation of the bequest as its natural state, I show that precarity, one that reflected both changing frames of value for Turner's legacy and the ongoing specter of environmental catastrophe, was fundamental to its formation and continued existence. So let us now, to use Ruskin's words, give our attention to the bequest and its relationship to the institution we sit in today. In the early 20th century, the works on paper were transferred from the National Gallery to the Tate. The lower area of the National Gallery, where Ruskin first encountered the mildewed pages, proved insufficient to protect the collection from damage. As former MP Sir Hugh Gilzian-Reid wrote to the Times in 1906, "It is a positive scandal that the studies and sketches so full of charm and instruction to those who have been privileged to see them should be housed in cellars more or less dark and damp, or huddled together in bundles, moldy and neglected." While Henry Tidmarsh's 1885 view of the basement that you can see on the left is one of relative order, the contrast with the light-filled Turner Gallery above is evident. These relatively insalubrious environs reflected the ongoing controversy about the place of paper in Turner's oeuvre. While Ruskin insisted on the central role of these fragments to British art writ large, he also struggled with their value. Turner's will did not reference the paper portion of the bequest, and it came to the nation as an unintended consequence of the contestation of his will. Nevertheless, the House of Lords celebrated the accession, approvingly noting that the gift included drawings which were above all price. Unfinished sketches, they surmised optimistically, could be useful for students. Ruskin, less diplomatic, classified the papers into categories of right in intention, of middling value, and entire rubbish. Whether detritus of the artist's studio or invaluable teaching tool, the drawing's value remained provisional. The subterranean home of the paper bequest reflected the hierarchical relationship between sketches and paintings. The location stymied access. Lionel Cust, the director of the National Portrait Gallery, wrote in 1906 that they were viewed only by, quote, "those who are courageous enough to descend for that purpose." Cust suggested that the new Tate Gallery, which opened in 1897, offered ample space for a new Turner building, through which, he continued, the development of art in England could not fail to be stimulated. The proposed shift was therefore one of redemption for both bequest and museum. Originally, the Tate displayed artists born after 1790, retaining luminaries like Constable, Hogarth, and Turner for the National Gallery. The construction of the Turner Galleries at the back of the Tate in 1910 and the arrival of Turner's extensive paper archive precipitated a shift in the museum's mission. And from 1915 to 1919, the institution expanded to encompass British art from 1500 to the present. Amid the cataclysm of the First World War, the Tate offered a cohesive cultural identity that tied contemporary art to centuries of British accomplishment. In the hands of a succession of curators, the bequest was molded to fit wide-ranging theories about the relationship between artist and British art history. Paper, in many ways, substituted for the man. A.J. Finberg, an art historian, was given administrative power in 1905 and set about imposing systemization. Ruskin grouped images by their pseudomorphic relationship or subject matter, while Finberg maintained a strict chronology, as you can see from this map, organizing sketches within the artist's biography. While this classification facilitated a more scholarly approach without the precarity of Ruskin's value judgments, it belied the provisional nature of the sketches. Finberg wrestled loose papers and barely visible lines into a legible history of Turner's career. But this was an unwieldy array of objects, many byproducts of artistic process rather than quantifiable artistic products themselves. Even at the Tate, the status of the papers, from finished watercolors to slate pencil sketches, remained subordinate to oil paintings. And despite Gilsey and Reed's hope that the move to the Tate would free sketches from their moldy cellars, there too, the paper remained in a basement storage room. Neither Finberg's careful organization nor the wooden drawers in which the papers were stored at the Tate could resist the wet British climate that Turner pursued on his trips to Scotland or the Lake District. In the middle of a frigid night in January 1928, the Thames, whose dark currents run less than 100 feet from the Tate's entrance, burst through the stone embankment walls, inundating the museum and the working class community that surrounded it. Water rushed into basement apartments, killing 10 people. It rose 8 feet into the Tate's lower level, completely submerging a third of the bequest pages. Watercolor ran, ink lines blurred, and paper buckled. This neighborhood was susceptible to flooding because it was constructed on a marsh. Until the beginning of the 19th century, the watery ground was used to banish people and objects deemed unsavory. There were almshouses, rubbish heaps, and further west, near, in fact, the hotel where many of the conference attendees are staying, a plague pit. The alignment of the area with London's poorest communities continued in the late 18th century, when Jeremy Bentham attempted to secure the site for the construction of the Panopticon, his model prison now made famous by Michel Foucault's work. While Bentham's project ultimately failed, the government eventually did build a prison there, and the infamous Millbank Penitentiary was completed in 1816. Yet the marsh still defined the landscape. Water seeped into the foundation, the building almost immediately began to sink, and a cholera outbreak was caused by contaminated river water. At every turn, the water won. The Tate, constructed on top of the demolished prison in 1897, proved equally susceptible to natural elements. While museums were intended to insulate works within from the physical impacts of weather, the marshy ground loosened divisions between the built and natural environments. People and things with contested value, consigned to underground spaces, bore the brunt of the resulting damage. After the flood, panicked letters flew between the Tate, the government right up the road in Westminster, and London newspapers. Liberal MP Isaac Hoare Belisha asked the House of Commons why a national jewel languished underground. The Times cited the sodden portfolios of the Turner sketches, which seemed to have been reduced almost to a hopeless condition, with leaves sticking together and mud bespattering the whole. Finberg cannily leveraged the flood to draw attention to larger problems of value. An incalculable amount of damage has already been done to the drawings, not merely by the Thames flood, but by their past treatment as gallery objects, he told the Times. These important artworks, Finberg believed, were meant to be controlled and maintained rather than circulated as gallery objects or educational tools. This assessment is borne out by a contemporaneous Tate valuation, in which the works on paper of the Turner Bequest were worth more by far than any other group of objects in the collection. However, a memorandum drafted in response to Finberg's allegation of mistreatment countered the assumption that their worth was analogous to finished oil paintings. It is possible that some have lost slightly in brilliance, but it must be borne in mind that many of the watercolors in the portfolios were far from perfect, being those cast aside by Turner or rubbed or injured by rough treatment, they wrote. Damage was part of the paper bequest's material condition, so much so that it was difficult to distinguish between injuries done by Turner and those brought by the river. The sketches were, the Tate suggested, objects with unstable value. In the weeks after the flood, conservators from the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert rushed to the Tate's aid. A spread in the sphere depicts the rescue effort, emphasizing order in the wake of the chaotic flood. A caption reads, "First aid to the injured." Sorry, you can't really see it in the reproduction, but it's down there. And indeed, the neatly organized boxes are reminiscent of hospital beds, with conservators attending to each in turn. Their intervention was largely limited to squeezing water out with irons and blotting papers, as this photograph on the left illustrates. While this was effective, it also occasioned a curious transformation. Some of the sodden works bled onto the blotting paper, creating a mirror image object that robbed the original of its pencil or watercolor forms. These were new works created by environmental contingency. The blotting papers contain a visible trace of the muddy river, and the water superimposed undulating lines on the surface, rendering the image indistinct. They are in a fluid middle ground between work of art and artifact, integrating mildew stains, brown splotches of mud, and areas of careful cross-hatching. Nude figures are caught in the rippling tide of the Thames. Crucially, these images are not considered part of the original bequest. They were unmoored from Turner's authorship, their value disrupted by the river. Maybe, however, their conditional nature ties them to the bequest more strongly, just another fragment created out of the meeting of artist and environment. The flood was, in some ways, a singular event in its ferocity. Yet it reminds us that museum walls remain porous to the social and natural environments around them. Such entanglement might render artworks uncomfortably susceptible, but also gives them richness, like, as Ruskin wrote, the unexpected effects in brilliant portions of skies created from an accidental finger mark. So I'll close with the work of Cornelia Parker, an artist who sees the brilliance in accident. Her 1998 Room for Margins unearthed and displayed the blotting papers and a series of canvas liners, including some removed from Turner's flood-damaged canvases. Like the blotting papers, these were not only historic documents, Parker contended, but formally inventive ones. They bear the marks of the 1928 flood and the shadow of stretcher bars, somehow echoing Turner's drift towards abstraction, she writes, unsettling norms of authorship by elevating environmental factors as representational ones. The Tate ultimately reaccessioned the liners as Parker's artwork, in what I see as a collaboration between Turner, Parker, museum conservators, and the Thames. As we increasingly approach paper and canvas in digital form, arrayed before us on a pixelated screen, Parker insists on the corporeality of art. She intervenes in the hierarchy of value inherent to the bequest, elevating to our attention that which Ruskin might have called entire rubbish. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobah. And we've got one more paper before our 10-minute comfort break. I think that's right. So this is Caterina Franciosi. She is a PhD candidate in history of art at Yale University, and her dissertation Latent Light, Energy and 19th Century British Art investigates how British art engaged the socio-ecological transformations wrought by an expanding fossil-fueled economy in the 19th century. Her paper will recenter the human politics of Turner's depictions of topographies ruptured by extractive capitalism, by paying attention to the artist's figures and the entangled histories of labour and environmental shifts that Turner witnessed and recorded.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So my paper today is really a condensation of a much larger argument, and I'm happy to expand on any aspects during the Q&A. Figures at work haunt Turner's landscapes of Britain's fossil-fueled economy. In a luminous watercolor, now in the Bequest, Turner captured a scene of nocturnal labor on the River Tyne at South Shields, Newcastle's main shipping port and hub of England's most celebrated coal field. Under a blinding moon disk piercing the blue sky traversed by billowing clouds and industrial smoke, figures gather, yield shovels around a red-hot coal fire, converse on the quay, crowded with large ships. A railway wagon on a platform looms over these figures, framed by masts and rigging. Its crudely delineated wheels resemble staring eyes, yet the Tynesiders remain oblivious to its surveillant presence. Turner completed the watercolor in 1823 for translation into mezzotint in Rivers of England. Within the series, the feverish night scene at Shields formed the counterpart to a serene view of the Tyne traversing Newcastle and Gateshead, populated by the myriad working figures on which the prosperity of the river city depended. The working bodies in Shields, however, were both central and disruptive to this economy. These figures are the keelmen, river workers navigating flat-bottomed barges known as keels, ferrying coal from the banks of the Tyne to its estuary. In Shields, they shovel the fuel into colliers bound for London. Newcastle's low bridges and shallow waters prevented large ships from loading upriver, so the keelmen were central to the circulation of coal. Contemporaries described them as a hardy, robust, and laborious race of men, admired for the strength of their bodies, but also feared for their strikes and proto-union organizations. During Turner's repeated visits to the Tyne, the keelmen were protesting the expanding network of states, railways, and steamers that threatened to make the keelmen's work redundant. The state and railway is the apparatus that Turner depicted encroaching on these figures. 1823, a date that Turner inscribed emphatically next to his signature in the watercolor, marked the keelmen's defeat after a prolonged strike. Yet in Shields, Turner refuses to portray the figures as passive or defeated by the mechanizing landscape. I show instead that he dramatized with calligraphic precision those labor practices that enabled the keelmen's communal resistance. Turner's nuanced engagement with the politics of labor on the Tyne resurfaced in the oil painting Keelmen Heaving in Coals by Moonlight, exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1835, and upstairs, which is really exciting. So the canvas was commissioned by a Manchester cotton industrialist as a pendant to the portrayal of Venice's stagnant commercial economy and opulent society. Here, the keelmen appear as a diminutive, tentacular crowd of dark, face-light silhouettes set against a vortex of thickly impastoed moonlight. Yet seen in relation to the patron's entanglement in landscapes of mechanization and strike-breaking in Manchester, these erased figures become all but reassuring staffage of the industrial sublime. So scholars, and including those in the environmental humanities, have often approached the human figures in Turner's industrial topographies as merely anecdotal, as metaphorical appendages to the atmospheric rendition of environmental damage and industrial processes. These are phenomena that Turner conveyed through the rarefied form and thick, painterly gestures familiar from landscapes like Rain, Steam, and Speed, that are historical icon of coal-fired velocity. Here, Turner's near erasure of the horse-drawn plough and the rowers on the river has helped secure the painting's dominant interpretations. We see the thundering engine slicing the canvas, the collapse of coal combustion with the forces of nature, rather than the human politics that enabled this spectacle. So as Eric Shane's urges, we must reverse our perspective to understand the human motives around which Turner consistently organized his compositions, to see the human landscapes he produced. On the time, these motives belonged to a community that endured and actively resisted fossil capital. Turner's travels through northern districts followed closely the Gilman's geographies and trajectories of struggle and decline. In 1801, he drew an intricate panorama of Newcastle's architectural landmarks, likely from a vessel on the Tyne. Here, the monumental ships halted exactly where Turner depicted them, unable to pass under the arches. With a few confident marks, Turner also delineates a state above Tyne Bridge, where some of the 1,500 keelmen then employed would be loading their keels. By registering this infrastructural incompatibility, Turner inscribes the keelmen as indispensable to the spaces of coal circulation. In an 1809 sketch of Whitehaven, Cumbria's main coal port, Turner delineated the chaotic enmeshment of the workforce with the vast hurries, structures that funneled coal directly from railway wagons on elevated platforms into the holds of ships. But for all the emphasis on velocity and monumentality, Turner simultaneously crystallizes moments of work and rest that undermine the machine's promise of seamless transfer. Workers rest on the quay and steer the coal descending from the machine. In 1809, on the Tyne, keelmen were destroying similar structures, the spouts. During their negotiations, documented in the archives, they described themselves as, quote, part of the machinery, identifying the source of their power in their collaboration with the expanding technologies of fossil capital. Turner here visualizes a similar relational model in a key geography of the coal trade, portraying machinery as a tool shaped and contested by the collective agency of workers. Turner visited County Durham in 1816, after the keelmen of the River Wye had burned the states. His watercolors of 1817 for Robert Surtees's Antiquarian History of County Durham turned the estates of coal owners into bucolic visions. Yet in a watercolor of Gibbsite, Turner also subtly signals the underground foundations of this wealth. Trails of white vapor over denuded riverbanks in the foreground hints at ongoing extraction. A column of black smoke in the left corner merges with the foliage in the foreground. The Earl of Strathmore, the owner of this estate, his estate sat atop coal seams that sustained his family's monopoly of Durham coal in London. His grandfather had built the very estates targeted by the keelmen. Turner's sketches of Tyneside from 1818 are instead close encounters with the industrial underbelly of the surface of the coalfield. One figure on a barge wearing a flat-brimmed hat is likely a keelman. Traveling again towards Scotland along the east coast in August 1822, Turner likely boarded a collier, the same ship he would then depict in Shields. Returning to London in December, he would have read an extensive reportage of the keelmen's 10-week strike that had just ended. He then painted Shields at a moment of renewed awareness of the keelmen's power to disrupt the flows of energy of the industrial metropolis. In delineating the figures in the turbulent landscape, Turner adopts a calligraphic mode, stippling the dark forms of their bodies, enumerating with fine brushes the flat-brimmed caps, striped clothing, oars, baskets, and lamps. He slows down the painting process. All of these details correspond to descriptions of the keelmen in contemporary sources. Men climb coal mounds wielding shovels, women assist them in the keels and converse with seamen. More figures trail along the flanks of the ships, tracing a rhythmic, serpentine motion. The tides, governed by the moon rising above, dictate the circular labor unfolding in the scene, loading, unloading, returning. Turner arranges crimson outlines of shoveling keelmen around an almond-shaped coal fire. For these glittering bodies, the encounter with industrial heat is a moment of cohesion rather than complete dissolution. The wagon's diagrammatic form instead contrasts with the tidal configuration of the figures. Poised to discharge coal into an unseen spout, its flattened shape makes its position in space difficult to read, suggesting that it could at any moment topple over the figures below. The wagon signifies the threat posed by an integrated network of transportation, increasingly dominated by locomotive engines and steamers. An untraced old painting, reproduced as an engraving in 1887, shows steam power used directly as a strike-breaking tool in the strike of 1822. An engine mounted on a keel transports coal-laden keels along the Tyne, as the military secure protection from the few figures on the shore, pointing, observing. This monstrous apparatus was the invention of William Hedley, a colliery engineer who also likely commissioned the painting. The coal capitalist vision projects a landscape where steam power has expropriated the workers of their skills and thus of the source of their political power. Turner's watercolor, by contrast, insists on the laborer's presence in a spatial and temporal foreground. Even under threat, they are actively at work. The long strike of 1822 left the keelmen largely defeated. A Tyne Mercury article records the apology of 12 keelmen, one of the few moments their names surface in the public record. Reading Shields as an image in which the keelmen come into focus allows us to situate it in connection with archival materials such as this one, often overlooked because they do not speak directly to the artist's or the audience's perspective. Alan Sikula has defined this kind of materials as a shadow archive, a record of all the embodiments of the unworthy. Shields forms one such site of embodiment. Here, the unnamed keelmen find a rare opportunity for visibility. In 1835, Turner reworked the composition for Manchester's most prominent cotton spinner, Harry McConnell. Within the syntax of a Claudian seaport, nature and human bodies stand in a disjointed scale. The moonlight assumes cosmic proportions and a sort of sculptural, a painterly presence, while workers shrink to faceless silhouettes, engulfed by thickening smoke. The staves and wagons also recede in space, absorbed by the atmosphere. A single orange dot marks the presence of a burning engine. When the painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy, critics found the juxtaposition of cosmic light and obscured working bodies morally unsettling. The Literary Gazette lamented Turner wasted glorious moonlight on coal whippers. So the critics' repulsion underscores the working body's latent capacity to disrupt an aristocratic spectacle of modernity, even in the erased form of the dark silhouette. So the vision of a tentacular workforce in a volatile landscape then would have offered little reassurance for McConnell. In his imposing mills in Manchester, cotton from slave plantations in the American South was worked by child and female workers, laboring for 69 hours a week at the steam-powered mules. McConnell's spinners, like other groups in Manchester's cotton industry, engaged in repeated strikes between 1808 and 1835. So the patron's participation in networks of environmental and human exploitation enabled his ownership of Turner's paintings, the networks in which the Tyne also played a pivotal role. At the same time, viewing the Tyne and McConnell's factory floor as linked spaces through Turner's paintings allowed us to position the Keelman and McConnell's cotton workers on the same barricade, contesting these landscapes, both real and represented. A Keelman positioned as a rooken figure in the foreground crystallizes the painting disruption of the aristocratic protocols of the Sublime. Seen from behind, the dark figure occupies the vantage point of the bourgeois observer, experiencing landscapes as a form of yearning for a lost nature. Yet, as a Keelman, this figure frames the scene as the product of the worker's complex experience of agency, community, and loss. Anonymous and unmoving, watching his brother's work from a distance, the figure is nearly lost to darkness. And yet, Turner insists, still stands. Thank you.
So welcome back to the second part of our panel. We have two more speakers, and the first is Sarah Gould. She is an assistant professor at Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, where she focuses on the study of British art. Her academic interests lie at the intersection of the material and ecological meanings of art, and she has published and presented widely on Turner from an eco-critical perspective. She's currently working on her second book, which explores pollution in and of painting and visual culture in the 19th century. And today she is asking what was in Turner's lungs, and she's historicising the idea of air. So, Sarah.
Thank you to everyone and for this introduction. The installation Sunset Provisioning by Yuri Patterson, installed in 2023 in the Clore Gallery, simulates an artificial sunset suspended above the ocean. Its radiance is not fixed but responsive, controlled by sensors tracking in real time pollution levels such as carbon dioxide, pollution particle matter, ozone, and formaldehyde. Rising pollution levels yield a sunset that grows increasingly saturated and vibrant. The monitoring system used, known as a URAD monitor, and developed by a Romanian engineer from the post-Chernobyl generation, collects data from the immediate environment. The installation thus makes perceptible a disquieting reciprocity. In short, the more polluted the air that viewers inhale, the more dazzling the spectacle that unfolds before them. The work faces a group of Turner watercolor sketches of atmospheric skies, participating in the same air, sharing the same climatic envelope. According to the wall text, I quote, "The subjects of some of the sketches are veiled in mist or dissolved in the light, giving them an ambiguous, abstract appearance." The pairing invites viewers to register how both sets of images emerge from conditions of suspended matter in the air. An ambiguous, abstract appearance. This is a familiar reading of Turner's work, one that ascribes abstract or proto-abstract qualities to his paintings, and whose genealogy I'm not going to repeat here. Over the past 40 years, indeed, scholars have rightly, so I think, pushed back against this interpretation, emphasizing instead Turner's commitment to represent atmospheric and elemental phenomena as accurately as possible. Yet I want to ask, what if these two readings were not incompatible? Turner was painting at a moment when Britain's atmospheres were dramatically darkened and obscured. The air itself impeded vision, softened contours, and rendered forms less legible. While there's nothing abstract about polluted air or its effects on health, biodiversity, today the WHO estimates about 6.7 premature deaths annually attributable to air pollution. The very history of polluted air is also, I argue, a story of abstraction. To shift the focus to polluted air, a subject that surprisingly has only gained attention in environmental historical studies over the past 15 years, I'll frame this talk through the lens of breathing and respiration. This approach means considering polluted air not simply as a backdrop to industrialization, nor solely as a question of Turner's personal attitudes towards pollution or what it enabled him to depict. Rather, it requires taking air itself seriously, historicizing it, asking what breathing in and out has to do with aesthetics, and how paintings become sites for broader social negotiations over environmental responsibility. So what exactly was in Turner's lungs? And I should acknowledge that this brilliant formulation comes from Esther Chadwick, as I was discussing a former project with her. We might say that Turner was breathing the air of classicism, but the question becomes differently productive if taken literally. How might thinking in terms of breathing help us reread his work, less to speculate about Turner's health? And I'm sorry if you were expecting some new theory about what Turner died from. But to consider the atmospheric conditions that entered his body and by extension permeated his practice. Such a shift in perspective prompts us to think not only about the air that sustained the artist, but also about the air that surrounded his works, raising the related question of their environmental vulnerability and health. Both Ruskin and Thornbury recognized the environment in which Turner grew up as somewhat formative. One defined in Ruskin's words by dinginess, smoke, soot, dust, and dusty texture. Thornbury also recounts that at the age of 10, Turner was sent to Brentford to stay with an aunt, away from what he called London's Cimmerian gloom and crimsoning fogs. He added, with emphasis, want of air, chief disease in London. In 1810, Turner noted instructions for smoking stramonium, a potent herb commonly used at the time to relieve asthma. For indeed, in the years when Turner was an active artist, London was by far the most polluted city in the world. Its atmosphere was not a neutral background, but an active, pervasive presence. The air he breathed, the haze he observed, and the visual medium through which he painted. Even in an early Turner, such as London from Greenwich Park, painted in 1809, he adopts an elevated vantage point from which the city stretches into a hazy distance. The localized atmospheric blur is produced through scumbling, a term that Joyce told me yesterday was a little bit outdated, but a thin, dry layer of pigment dragged across a darker surface, allowing the underlayer to flicker through in broken intervals. The technique performs at the scale of the brush strokes, the very effects it depicts, the diffusion of particles suspended in the air. The poem that accompanies the painting laments about the city, about the fact that the city has lost its legibility. Architectural forms of the London skyline losing their definition through smoke. In the watercolor view of London from Greenwich, this dynamic becomes sharper. Turner portrays an industrial city enveloped in smoke and steam, much of it generated by the steamships carrying sea coal along the Thames. Sea coal, as we just saw, imported from Newcastle, fueled much of Britain and its circulation quite literally shaping the air of London. So what is happening here? The spectator remains outside the turbulence that will later engulf Turner's viewers. Yet, the proliferating chimneys obscure the distinction between individual sources of emission, presenting pollution as diffuse and pervasive. As in London from Greenwich Park, the elevated and relatively clear viewpoint conveys a residual sense of control. In 1825, on the threshold of intensified industrial expansion, and at the moment when pollution begins to acquire the meaning it holds today, the moment when the term becomes naturalized. From the perch of the city's outlines, the city's outlines remain just readable before their dissolution into haze. Turner effectively turns the maps towards the viewer and away from the smoky city, marking the moment at which visibility yields to industrial air. His works materialize and mediate pollution's shifting scale and temporality, tracing and materializing its transformation from a controllable nuisance into an enveloping condition. Upon Turner's death, his collection, bequeathed to the nation, was found in disrepair in his Queen Anne Street gallery, as we just saw. So it's really a continuity with the three papers we just heard. The 1853 Select Committee on the National Gallery reported, I quote, "After 30 years in Mr. Turner's wretched gallery, the dirt hung over it like dirt from the smoke of a chimney." Constable had once commented on the Turner paintings in the collection of John Sheepshanks. I quote, "Some of Turner's best work is swept off the carpet every morning by the maid and put into the dust hole." The conditions shaping Turner's breathing likewise shaped the material life of his works. The Sheepshanks collection is instructive. Commenting on its condition, Richard Redgrave lamented about, I quote, the accumulations of varnish, dust, and smoke that coated many of the works, voicing further on the donor's own concerns. When Sheepshanks offered his collection in 1857, he insisted that it be housed far from Trafalgar Square, free from the inconveniences and dirt of the main thoroughfares of the metropolis, proposing Kensington as a suitable alternative. The collection was subsequently housed on the site that later becomes the Victoria and Albert Museum. Such a concern had been voiced when in 1850, a year before Turner's death, a landmark date for conservation science, a select committee at the National Gallery examined whether the institution should be moved westward, away from Trafalgar Square, because the condition of the pictures was deteriorating amidst urban pollution. This forms part of the broader context of conservation debates at the National Gallery, especially those surrounding the cleaning of paintings. Such debates weren't new in England. Awareness of smoke's damaging effects on artworks has a long history, already articulated in 1661 by John Evelyn in the Fumigium, an early environmental treatise in which he speaks about the effects of smoke on pictures. And this concern resurfaces repeatedly in the 19th century. In 1803, Julius Caesar Ibbotson advises painters to relocate westward in search of cleaner air, a recommendation consistent with his own interest, or perhaps not actually, but with his own interest in depicting extractive and industrial sites. There was, of course, also a cultivated taste for darkened pictures, a preference explicitly invoked in the Select Committee minutes. And here I couldn't help myself not to include this Hogarth's extraordinary print of Time smoking a picture, which mocks this purposeful taste for aged pictures. A big pot of varnish by its side, Time is here destroying a classical landscape painting twice, with the scythe and by billowing smoke through a pipe smoke, smoking the landscape as one would smoke a piece of meat. Within these debates, the 1850 report established by Charles Eastlake, Michael Faraday, and William Russell has become a landmark text. It was at this moment that this decision to systematically use glass to protect artworks was recommended. This report and its accompanying interrogations disclosed in the minutes reveal that protecting artworks from damage was understood as a matter of institutional urgency, more so even perhaps than later in the century. The minutes also register a fascination with technological innovation. In this sense, it constitutes a case in which technology was mobilized to counteract pollution, situating the history of conservation within the broader field of environmental history. Collecting thus becomes a site in which questions of environmental justice and moral responsibility are negotiated, especially through debates on ventilation and air quality. And here I recommend the work of Nick Robbins and Stephanie O'Rourke. From 1850, artworks in Britain were systematically glazed. Glass provided a technical solution to polluted air, a material intervention that also participated in what I understand as the abstraction of the very concept of pollution. As pollution became increasingly quantifiable, more measurable, and more thoroughly described, technology appeared as the natural remedy, the ideal mechanism through which environmental harm could be managed. The presence of Faraday, the expert par excellence, known for his widely circulated 1855 remarks on the polluted condition of the Thames, exemplify this shift. He represents an era that placed its trust in technical solutions conceived probably in good faith, but ones that did not necessarily address deeper structures of environmental control. The 1850 report therefore registers one form of what Judith Reinhorn describes as, I quote, an accommodation, an adaptation to a toxic atmosphere enacted through glass, which mediates between the artwork and the world whose air has become increasingly uninhabitable. This brings me to my final section, which offers, I hope, a way of approaching three long-standing complexities in Turner studies. First, this paradox of Turner not caring for the conservation of his works, yet leaving his works to the nation, buying them back. Thinking in terms of respiration and polluted air helps to reframe this tension. Pollution is, in economic terms, I quote, matter without a price, to use the phrase of the political theorist Alisa Battistoni. It is a surplus material with negative use value. Turner's paintings, by contrast, were highly valued commodities. By producing works that materially registered what industrial society refused to value by embracing waste, Turner invites us to rethink ecological worth. 2. Was Turner enthralled by industrial modernity or critical of it? And here, again, I'm adding this slightly off-topic print by Daumier, where the cloud of pollution is entitled Progress. The issue is not Turner's intentions, but the status he accorded to pollution as a byproduct of industrial life. This is already evident in the reception of his work at the time. Pollution appears as a reminder in Adorno's term, or as a, pardon my French, restance in Derrida's sense, something supplemental, persisting after everything else has been commodified. Contemporary commentators remarked on this residue repeatedly. Turner's atmospheres contain the very excess that modernity tried unsuccessfully to expel. The third tension concerns abstraction. The question is not simply whether Turner moved away from representation. Rather, another kind of abstraction is at stake, the abstraction of pollution itself. Industrial chemistry rendered air pollutants measurable, classifiable, and paradoxically, conceptually detached from lived experience. At the same time, polluted atmospheres erased or softened individual faces, blurred crowds, and dissolved contours. Turner's atmospheric effects expose this tension. They show how industrial modernity both materialized polluted air and abstracted it from view. Writing about the atmosphere of post-war Britain in The Tiger and the Smoke, Linda Need writes, "The fog is a time machine. It, I quote, has obliterated temporality and progress and has brought the present into direct contact with the past from which it has distanced itself." She's describing here the Great Smog of 1952 and the ensuing Clean Air Act of 1956. But her formulation, past and present wrapped and folded together, resonates more broadly, including in the dialogue between Patterson and Turner evoked in this introduction. It also suggests that materialization of environmental shifts in art is not conveyed solely through explicitly industrial imagery. Take Turner's Venice from the Giudecca, enclosed in 1897 in a sealed climatic case, a Simpson box, never opened since, and bearing witness to the air deemed necessary to preserve it. And one might imagine, I like to think, that if it were opened, a brief exhalation of late 19th century atmosphere would. What I aimed at showing today is that Turner's works do not simply depict these histories. They carry the history of air, of pollution, across their surfaces and into the present, participating in the very temporal folding that need identifies, where past and present meet. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So we have one more paper, and then I'll invite the speakers to come back onto the stage for Q&A. And this is Parham Ghalmdar. He's a multidisciplinary artist based in the UK. He trained as an oil painter and currently holds a scholarship as a certificate student at the New Centre for Research and Practice, and is the recipient of a 2024-5 APP Creative Commissions Programme Award from Leeds Arts University. His ongoing projects critically engage with themes of speculative realism, post-human curatorial practice, and the intersections between traditional media and algorithmic creativity. And today, he'll be presenting Necro-Geographies of the Sublime, a posthuman reckoning with Turner's horizons, as a multimedia video essay that reimagines landscape painting through generative AI, viewed through J.M.W. Turner's legacy.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm Parham Ghalmdar. I'm a painter, filmmaker, and researcher, and I've been working with machine learning as a tool to rethink, renegotiate our understanding of painting, reproduction of paintings, and landscaping paintings. And today I'm going to talk about a very specific experiment, which involves GAN AI models, GAN. GAN stands for Generative Adversarial Networks. And to train the AI model, I used hundreds of cheap reproductions of two paintings by Turner, the slave ship and the rain, steam, and speed. I'm going to show 3 videos in the middle, which includes like flickering imagery. If anyone has sensitivity to that, I just want to give you a warning before I play anything. So I will show you these videos that the videos show the process that I used to think about Turner's legacy as it passes through global reproduction and machine vision, right? Okay, so these 2 images are the images of the original paintings, and bear with me. These 2 paintings are sit at the core of our understanding of Turner. The slave ship is depicting a storm, abolition, violence, sea as a mass grave, and the rain, steam, speed painting as an image of industrial acceleration and, very literally depicting railway carving through the landscape. So these images are embedded in the art history, in museums, and the way we imagine the Sublime today. But the data set that I used is not the high-fidelity museum photography. These ones, okay. So, but these 2, the dimensions and some details might give it away. These 2 are the reproductions of the paintings made in workshops in China and exported from China to UK to be sold as, decor objects. to kind of sold as Turner-style paintings for living rooms and lobbies. So before we get to the AI part, Turner, I need to emphasize that Turner's images have already passed through a global industrial pipeline, from the 19th century British painting to digitized museum images to JPEGs used as references, the Chinese painting workshops copying those JPEGs at scale, and back to the UK as inexpensive art. So this is exactly where the necroeconomy around the image is happening. The dead labor, the repetitive gesture, compressed history, all circulating as affordable luxury. So I photographed and scanned some of these copies and used them as entire training data for the GAN model. So the model has never seen the original Turner. It only sees the global afterlife of Turner as a kind of a cheap object. So what is the GAN AI model? I just need to explain that before I go any further. Before I show you what happens actually when you put the Turner's paintings, the images of the paintings into the GAN model, I need to briefly explain how the GAN works in plain language. You can think of the system as two neural networks playing a game. One neural network acts as the imposter, tries to generate images that look like the training data, in this case, the Turner copies. And the second one, the other network, is the gatekeeper. It looks at the image and decides whether this is a real image from the data set or is this a fake produced by the imposter. So at the beginning, the imposter produces pure visual noise, and the gatekeeper rejects almost everything because it can still spot the difference. But over the time, which for this project was like something like 8 hours, over the time through this adversarial game, the imposter gets better at fooling the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper gets better at telling the real from the fake. So they're locked in a feedback loop, and the imposter learns to sculpt the noise into something that looks like a Turner copy, and the gatekeeper turns what Turner-ness looks like in this strange world of cheap reproductions. What interests me is not arriving at the perfect fake, but watching this struggle. So this, I guess the difference between the GAN model and the LLMs, the large language models like ChatGPT people use every day, the difference is that this GAN model is kind of exposing and exhibiting the place of the struggle of what is happening in there. But watching this struggle, watching how a machine fed with globalized Turner debris slowly learns to hallucinate the painting. Okay, so this is paused so we can see the first frame, and then it will be played. As you can see, like the difference, the gap between the frames between each attempt at the beginning is so much more, and then as it goes on, it's still being played, it's not paused. The difference is way, way, way less, as if it becomes a static image. It's still playing, and then now it's paused on the last frame. So I'm going to let it be played one more time. It's very quick, it kind of escapes the attention. You're basically seeing the game played between the two networks. Imposter trying to fool the gatekeeper. You can think of it as, I kind of think of it as the artist and the curator sometimes. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next one, which is the train painting now instead of the ship. So what we're seeing here is like it's the pure noise, uninterpretable storm. With each step, the imposter learns from the gatekeeper's feedback. Patches of color start to stabilize. The model guesses maybe there should be a band of orange sky here, a diagonal sharp shape there. The gatekeeper punishes or rewards those guesses. So to me, the process looks like a slow hunting. Turner's compositions are not reproduced from a high-res scan, but they are condensed out of noise for a game between these two competing networks. The imposter is not creative in any human sense. It's optimizing for one thing only, fooling the gatekeeper. So it's more than being close to the arc. I mean, if we look at it in the world of humanism, the imposter is closer to the archetype of a trickster rather than an artist. But in doing so, it reenacts a kind of sublime. A storm of random pixels is slowly organized into something like a ship, a wave, a train, a bridge, a smoke, etc., etc. Horizons align and misalign. Figures appear as vague knots of contrast, then vanish again. So you can read this as a computational allegory of Turner's own practice, starting from chaos and pushing towards form, or starting from abstract pushing towards form. But the crucial difference here is that the push is driven by feedback loop between the imposter and the gatekeeper rather than an individual artist. So the Necro-Geography begins right here. The landscape is not painted, but it's negotiated between two non-human agents, guided by the dataset built on outsourced human labor and historical violence. I mean, they're tiny, but these are all like a lot of the reproductions just next to each other. So I want to just emphasize on the material, on the political layer of the data set. It really matters here. The data set was like something around. I borrowed 600 reproductions. God knows how many of it exists in UK, around UK. Made by largely anonymous workers in painting factories, painting workshops, warehouses. I don't know what they call them really. Copying images of Atlantic slavery, industrial expansion, built for Western homes and offices, at a price point that makes them having a Turner into accessible decor choice. Each of them was like something around £200, so I didn't buy them. I just borrowed them. When I digitize those canvases and feed them into GAN, I'm not working with Turner images. I'm working with the afterlife of the slave ship as decorative product, the afterlife of the railway as a nostalgia commodity, an afterlife of Turner's Sublime as an aesthetic filter applied to the living room. The GAN doesn't care about any of these, obviously. It only sees statistical patterns. But as an artist, I do care. And I want to stage that indifference. The adversarial game between imposter and gatekeeper runs on top of a supply chain of pigment, shipping containers, data centers, electricity grids, and so much more. There is this human and ecological cost stacked under every generated image of Turner's paintings. So when I call these images Necro-Geographies, I mean geographies built on dead labor and dead histories, landscapes that are reanimated by computation after being stripped of their ethical and political context. So this last video is like the final attempts of this adversarial game, just compiled on top of each other. And I was just, it got me thinking, when you put them all together, how much it looks like an animation of the scene, how much it looks like it comes to life suddenly. So this video shows what happens when we ask the train GAN to keep producing the same painting in the last attempts when the imposter has already fooled the gatekeeper. Instead of static image, we get this living instability, tiny tweaks, micro glitches, stream of colors. The ship or the train holds its position for a moment, then melts. The horizon takes a breath, straight, then bent, then doubed. Technically, this is just a GAN sampling again and again from the space of possible images it has learned, but visually it behaves like a painting that refuses to settle. It's as if the imposter and the gatekeeper has reached an uneasy compromise. They agree that this is Turner-ish enough, but only for a millisecond. On the next frame, they renegotiate again. So the painting becomes a process of struggle rather than an object. It's not object oriented anymore. The slave ship is not a single frozen scene, but a flickering probability cloud. The railway is not a fixed icon of progress, but a tremor that can't decide whether it's fog, smoke, bridge, or just noise. This is where the hyper-sublime appears, the scene that the image could collapse back into the chaos or abstraction at any moment. So, working with this model, one thing became immediately visible in the outputs. Everything was square. You might have noticed this already. Not because the data set was square, but because the architecture enforced a square shape. So the training of the training images, the data set was rectangular, even more rectangular than the original painting. So square, not the proportion of the original canvas, but a square, and sorry, bear with me. And the square ended up performing exactly the same conceptual function as a frame, maybe even more honestly. I was wondering why the square. I was so confused why the outcome is square without me giving any protocols for that. The GAN architectures assume square training images because most online data sets are normalized to a square, because Instagram, Tumblr grids, Pinterest boards, marketplace thumbnails have normalized a square visual commodity, because storage, batching, and also the GPU memory makes square efficient, because platform capitalism rewards modular reorderable tiles. So the logistics and the markets don't appear inside the images as decorative frames. They appear as dimensions, as aspect ratio, as the bounding box that defines what the machine thinks a painting is allowed to be. In the first image, at the first stage, this square behaves like a painter's surface, and it almost looks like a impasto abstract painting, like a raw field of colors. But it structurally, it also is behaving like a product photograph, a template, a stored Turner block inside a neural network. The square is the default commodity form. But then in the final stages, when the gatekeeper is fooled, by the time the image is stabilized, you end up with something uncanny, a square slave ship, a square railway. The Turner compressed into a geometry that has nothing to do with the 19th century British landscape and everything to do with the 21st century visual logistics. This turns square into a machine-imposed frame, not as a golden frame signaling aristocratic taste, but computational frame signaling platform alignment, dataset normalization, global flows of visual labor. That was intentional. Instead of the museum leaking into the image, the platform leaks into the image. Turner becomes square because the GPU prefers this square. Now, this is the moment that it's kind of, when we, like, artists might have had this a lot, that medium is a message. This is the moment that format becomes the message. The machine reveals the new institution, the format itself. And from this angle, the square is not the limitation, it's a forensic trace of the entire infrastructure the painting has traveled through. The workshop, the JPEG pipelines, model training loops, et cetera, all the way to the artist who's working with the GAN. For me, these GAN outputs are not the end point. They function as raw material as an artist working with them. I print them, I reprint them, I cut them, turn them into moving images, I bring them back into the physical space. That means there is another loop. The Turner's paintings are canonized, they are copied in China, imported into UK, the copies become dataset, the GAN hallucinates, and I rematerialize them, these hallucinations, as paintings, installations, video art, and then institutions show them again under the sign of Turner's legacy. So from a post-human perspective, we can say that Turner is now not one agent among many. It is now one agent among many. The original painter, the copyist, the GAN, my own decisions as an artist, and the curatorial framework. Not a single agent fully owns the image anymore. So when we talk about curating Turner now, or Turner contemporary, one caption is to curate these chains explicitly, to show the original, the copy, the AI hallucination, contemporary artwork all together, and to trace how Turner's horizon moves through logistics, labor, and computation. The point is not to celebrate AI Turner, but to use the GAN as a microscope for the afterlife of these images. Sorry. Okay. So this came out very apocalyptic because the ship is on the right. And it's so much more darker, like palette-wise. This is one of the, and strangely, like the gatekeeper accepted this as like close to original. It was very strange. So one more thing I want to acknowledge before ending: training and running GANs has an energy cost. The data centers, cooling systems, power grids, equipment. Just as Turner's industrial scenes are tied to coal and steam, these animated Turners are tied to electricity and server farms. So the project loops climate crisis back into the image in two ways: the content, the storm, the shipwrecks, the smog, the speed, and the substrate, the fossil fuel infrastructure enabling the machine vision. So the necro-geography here is historical and contemporary. The Atlantic as a graveyard of the slave trade, the British landscape as a corridor of extraction, transport, and the data center as a new kind of landscape, invisible but material. When we stare at these shimmering GAN Turners, we're looking at images that are both about and produced by regimes of extraction. The world Turner painted was shaped by British imperial logistics, including shipping lanes, insurance markets, extractive economies. And today's Britain involvement in global conflict continues through defense exports, intelligence infrastructures, and AI-enabled systems deployed in places like, Gaza. Turner's storm doesn't belong to the past. Its atmospheric violence reappears inside modern technologies of targeting and classification. There's not an argument against the technology, but it's more of a demand to read it through the same critical lenses we use for 19th century industry and empire. These two were some of the images that were rejected in the midway. I found it very interesting because they're symmetrical. So I'm going to end in a moment by just tightening the argument to 3 short points. The Turner's horizon has become an interface. It's no longer just a line of paint. It is a shape that connects global copying economies, cheap decor markets, machine learning models, contemporary curation. And secondly, GANs give us a way to watch this interface at work. The adversarial game between imposter and the gatekeeper makes it visible how the patterns of Turner-ness emerge from noise, error, and compromise and renegotiation. The glitches are not just technical artifacts, they are symptoms of how the archive has been constructed. And thirdly, the Necro-Geographies of the Sublime names the conditions where historical violence, industrial acceleration, globalized reproduction, and algorithmic imagination all converge in one unstable image. So in this project, Turner's paintings are not simply historical objects, but we're looking back, gazing back, but they are active agents in how machine now imagines the seas, storm, and speed. The question then is not only how we exhibit Turner today, but also how is Turner already being exhibited inside our machines, and what does that do to our collective sense of landscape, history, and possible futures? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. I think we've got about 10 minutes for, nearly, for questions. I thought I would just kick off while everyone has a little think about how they formulate their questions with a quick question that hopefully anyone or everyone could respond to. And that is, what is it about Turner, his work or his time, that generates so much eco-criticism? Is it to do with the wealth of material, especially the Turner Bequest? Is it his subjects, his approach, his legacy? Where would any of you like to start on that's inspired you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think many reasons, like experiencing it, like I live by the sea, and like experiencing storms. Like this year we had wildfires up on the moors, and like seeing that translated through Turner's work really does encapsulate those kind of ecological happenings. So I think that's partly it. But also I think it's touched in all of the papers, it's the intersectionality of the kind of environments depicted. So they touch on the kind of capitalistic, colonial kind of elements also at play. So I think they really do kind of talk about those wider systems and how they're all entangled together.
I'm thinking about beauty. If we live in these environments, smoke is not as, is outsourced now. There are still very smoggy atmospheres, but we don't see them in Britain anymore. But if we live, under the sky, what does it mean to find it beautiful? So, yeah.
I like what you just said, Sarah. I think there's something about both the kind of topographical specificity of Turner's works and his highly beautiful surfaces and pictorial gestures that we associate with a history of modern art and a history of modern experience that I think really kind of keep sort of drawing our historians to Turner's works. And I think that's also where the sort of, I think in my work, the kind of ambiguity of Turner's position becomes a sort of an opportunity to investigate other experiences that might be erased within these beautiful surfaces.
I also think there's an element here, because of the resources that we have in the bequest, of how aware we are of Turner's materials. And of course, the wonderful conservation work that's gone on around all of his paintings and paper is part of that. But thinking about him as a figure that is so materially enmeshed, and thinking about the ways that these physical objects that he's translating, very physical environments, actually bring art making into a much wider discourse that for him, I think, is also often political, which is why I've found such a depth of the human, to use your word, the human aspect of these landscapes that otherwise can seem very alienating from a political aspect, questions of labor or questions of, for me, right, the way that working class figures are seen as analogous to his paper and what I was just talking about. So bringing it back to the way that he is engaging with even just like the physicality of his paint, I think is part of what we can see.
I think, look, I was born and raised in Iran, and one of the items in our household that I vividly remember was a seascape oil painting, which was a copy of Turner painting. Like, it was a Turner-esque painting of an English ship in distance with like English flag. And I tried to pin down where that object comes from. Why would an Iranian middle class need a painting like that in their house? BP, before being BP, it was called Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The company was started because oil was discovered in Iran, and the British wanted to go there and had a contract and wanted to extract oil. And the back then BP brought a lot of staff from Britain, and to house them, they built red brick English-style towns in south of Iran. And one of the objects, like standard objects they had in the interior, was a Turner-esque oil painting. So it's like Turner is like ridiculously tied to everything everywhere. I don't know how. It's amazing. You can look at it from so many different angles. It's part of my childhood. I know that like a discourse around climate crisis and Turner might be a young discourse, but the ghost of it has always been haunting us. Maybe it's just a few years that we have managed to articulate it, maybe, but it's always been there.
I think that's probably close to where I start from as well, and a little bit from some of the other things you said, that Turner is often seen as the quintessential English artist, and this is where I think there's a lot of room for Constable as well. That if it's the England that we feel we need to protect from the climate crisis, but also he's depicting the beginning of that destruction. So it's that tension there that I think is so interesting. Who's got a question from the audience? Got one here and then here. And there.
Thank you. Yes, the last item I found very interesting because, for one thing, there wasn't one mention of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Now, that's significant because, A, the train is passing over a bridge which contemporaries said couldn't be built because of the nature of the arches. And the other factor is that the train is working on the broad gauge, which is much broader than the gauge used on the present day normal railway. And this was because Brunel considered that this would enable trains not only to run in a much steadier fashion, but to use far less fuel to attain the same objective of reaching Bristol in a short and equivalent time. And I think all of this illustrates the pride which we have over this period. We really have managed to overlay this positive approach to the environment, which was shared in the 1840s. We pretend that we have invented ecology and the environment, and that their approaches are not really worth consideration. I feel that altogether we're completely cutting ourselves off from these two great contemporaries, because after all, Turner was alive at the same time as Brunel, and Brunel unfortunately killed himself by overwork, but these were people who really put their all into their efforts, and they weren't these cardboard cutouts that we've been presented with, which I can see the relationship that there is between the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the supersession of coal burning in ships. All of these are relevant factors, but they're not the sole ones, and I don't think we're learning much by failing to take note of these great ancestors of ours. So thank you for stirring up these ancestral ideas of mine. And I was brought up in a steam age, remember. I was surrounded by steam engines and fog, and the smog. I've experienced the smog, the driver, the conductor having to conduct a trolleybus through the fog, the whole picture, and breathing in the smog, which miraculously I've managed to survive so far. So thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that. Oh my God, that was beautiful.
Have we got time for one more? Any very quick response before we get to one more question? Yeah. Okay, let's go for Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm struggling to form a question because my mind has been blown by this panel. I just wanted to say thank you to all the speakers, because I think you presented us almost with manifestos for how to think historically now. And I think all of the papers, for me, were sort of rejecting this approach of why is the past relevant today, and thinking in a completely different method, or presenting us with different methods. And Sarah, your point about the sort of enveloping the past and the present, this sort of continuum that we're sort of dealing with or trying to deal with through work. So it's just, for me, it was like a moment of realization of how to do this work and why Turner is enduring, why there's still, so much work just here on the stage, so many new perspectives. And I thought, in fact, it's something perhaps as well to do with the visionary and futurism. And particularly, Parham, your work was making me think about how we're in dealing with AI technologies and a new techno-future, which is not future, it's now. But whether Turner as something of a visionary who dealt with doom and destruction, as well as potentially light and liberation, the kind of paradoxes of the future, whether that's something there in that tension of the visionary. So I'm sorry, that's not very coherent as a question, but it's just because you presented so many thoughts about how Turner is still so productive and so providing us with this idea to think actually about the future as well as the past. So I'll stop there and hand over to Tim, who can probably do a more coherent question.
No, well, I would echo what Sarah said. It was a fascinating panel. And one thing I wanted to ask you all to reflect on was Turner's labour in relation to the various forms of labour that all of you discussed, the Chinese painters and the people who deal with these farms that create, suck out energy. And there are people there, right, labouring. And Martha, your wonderful Scarborough fishing people, and Sarah, you showed us so many fantastic, those Ibbotson images of people, on the streets of London, but also you showed us Leeds, which is the one place where Turner actually seems to be explicitly linking himself to the labour of the dyers and the wall builders and the workers in the textile factory. And also, actually, I really enjoyed Tobah, the guys digging out the stuff, the blokes in hats pulling out the wet paper. So my question for all of you, and Caterina, of course, the keel man, my question for all of you then is Turner's labour dirty? Or is Turner's labour somehow, because he's a genius, clean? And how does Turner, the labour of the artist using dirty pigments with dirty fingernails to make kind of dirty paintings, is that part of this industrial world that you've conjured, or is it the opposite of it? Is art a form of labour which is somehow scot-free from the environmental costs?
There's so much to say. Thank you. One way of addressing this is thinking in terms of the extractive pigments that he uses. Joyce Townsend showed us that he used a wide array of pigments, and a lot of them were, extracted. So that's one tiny way of answering this question.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think if we look at Turner's labor in his watercolors, we do see someone using his hands in a heavily, in a sort of dirty, very physical way, sort of smearing paints in the deadly watercolor, he uses his fingernail to carve the moonlight into the sky. So there's something of the kind of strength and scale of the body sort of displayed in these works. At the same time, in the canvases, there's a sort of fluidity and facility of the pictorial gestures that I think could suggest a very different relationship to the work of art making. And again, it's this sort of, I think, unsolvable ambiguity with Turner that I think also characterizes his labor.
Yeah, just quickly following on from that, I think his work is kind of tied in so much to that labouring as well, because he wasn't just making work for himself or to display, he was making it often for patrons. So there is that kind of pursuit of money, capital, and there was a lot of money tied up with his work. So I think that kind of forms part of that labouring that he is depicting, that he is part of that market as well. And like today, Turners are worth so much money, so it's still tied into that market of money that is so tied into environmental destruction and capitalism.
So the second question first, then I'll answer the first question. There is this pigment, I was just reading about it like last week, called Afghan blue. And it's mostly extracted, this mineral to make paint or, as used as pigment, is mostly extracted in Middle East, specifically Afghanistan. And it is usually, it's a pigment, it's a blue pigment. And this business is like a multi-million-dollar, really dirty business compared to bloody diamonds. Like so many people die every year, so many people live in poverty because of this business, on and on. So I think painting is a dirty business, figuratively and literally. And even before painting, back then there was no industrial paint to go buy from a market, so you had to make the paint yourself. So I don't know if you've ever made paint yourself, but even with the 6 German paint mills, it's a dirty thing to do. Like it's a nightmare to clean a paint mill after you used one color to put another pigment with another color, not to mix them. It's a nightmare to clean the machine. And when you make paint without the machinery, when you're doing it with hand, at the beginning it looks just like a muddy, dirty substance. It's only after it comes out of a modern machine, completely grinded and milled, that it's super consistent like Nutella. Before that, it's like a really dirty thing, looking like a dirty thing. And it's definitely part of being a painter and making paint and painting. And then I think the first question, I'm just thinking that, Turner was a human being just like any other human, and humans have different characters and personalities in different times and believe in different things. And humans, the nature of being a human is being self-contradicting in general. And I think we need to allow Turner to stay. He has the right to be a human, And I think we should live him being a human rather than trying to put all these branches together and have a flat kind of one reading or one understanding of him. I don't know. I definitely see depth drive at some points. There are depth drives, or a nostalgic depth drive. That is also part of the techno-fascism going on right now. But there's also definitely, that lively, curious traveler spirit in him that wants to see the world and enjoy the world and make more drawings of the world. So I don't know, I really don't know how to answer that question, but I think at different times, it's different times and periods of his life, it's probably different. I don't know. I really don't know.
I think that's all we've got time for, but there's a lot more work to do, I think, isn't there, and a lot more interpretations to come up with. Thank you very much.